The Spice Girls, one of the biggest ever pop groups from the 90s. Five women, five distinct personalities, and over 100 million records sold. A generation defining the meaning of girl power. And sometimes, despite all of that, one of the most fascinating parts of their story is something that many people completely missed. Buried beneath the platform shoes and the Union Jack dress and the chaos of late 90s celebrity culture is what appears to be a very real Sapphic love story. A story that may have inspired some of the group's music, and a story that has had fans whispering for decades. According to some people, a love story that contributed to the breakup of the Spice Girls themselves. Now, before we go any further, I want to make something very clear. This video is not about outing anybody. Everything discussed today comes from public interviews, autobiographies, documentaries, and statements made by Geri Halliwell and Mel B themselves. I'm not here exposing a secret. I'm talking about a piece of queer pop culture history that's been hiding in plain sight for years. Honestly, what fascinates me isn't even the possibility of Geri and Mel in a relationship. It's about how many people spent years insisting there was absolutely nothing there while simultaneously watching them flirt with each other on national television. Because if you've ever gone back and watched old Spice Girl interviews, yeah, it's actually quite difficult to describe them as being subtle, right? Maybe that's because queer audiences have always had a different relationship with pop culture, because we are experts at reading between the lines. We learn to spot stories in things that aren't openly being said, and we recognize chemistry before anyone else does. Sometimes we see things before other people do. And so today we're talking about Geri Halliwell and Mel B, the rumours, the evidence, songs that suddenly sound very different when you know the context behind them, and why one of the biggest girl groups in history may have also had one of the most overlooked sapphic stories in pop culture. Because the more I looked into this story, the less it felt like celebrity gossip, the more it felt like a fascinating example of how queer stories have always existed. It's just that nobody wants to call them that. So when people think about the Spice Girls today, they tend to remember them as the ultimate mainstream pop group. They were safe, fun, they were all about girl power, a group that's primarily aimed at teenage girls. But what often gets forgotten is that the Spice Girls were incredibly unconventional for their time. These weren't women quietly standing on the stage singing love songs about boys. They were loud and chaotic. They challenged people. They were messy. They talked openly about subjects like sex. They constantly broke expectations, and perhaps most importantly, they centered female relationships. The Spice Girls weren't selling romance, they were selling friendship. The entire band and the brand around them was built on the idea of relationships between women mattering, that your friends could be just as important as your boyfriend, and women could choose one another. Obviously, that intention wasn't specifically queer, but queer women have always gravitated towards stories about intense female relationships because historically that's all that there's often been. Before lesbian characters became commonplace, queer representation, but like before it's improved, women found themselves in stories about friendship instead, because that came with the concept of connection, devotion, partnership. Sometimes that's genuinely what the story is about altogether. And sometimes there is something happening beneath the surface, which brings us to Geri and Mel. Now, every group has members that naturally gravitate toward each other. From the very beginning, Geri and Mel seemed inseparable. And when you go back and you watch interviews from the 90s, it is striking and it's pretty obvious to see that they're constantly touching each other and teasing each other and seeking each other out. And they are absolutely besotted with each other, it would seem. They could indeed be portrayed as affectionate friends. That's true. But there is a point where you stop looking at individual moments and start looking at the patterns, because it wasn't just one interview or one photograph or one instance. It was years of behaviour and chemistry, years of a connection that other people around them seemed to notice. And what's interesting is that even at the height of Spice Girls mania, where fans, they were already picking up on that. Long before social media was a thing, long before queer fandoms became a mainstream thing, people were noticing something different about the dynamic between Geri and Mel. And if you watch them together now, it's hard not to see why. They had a kind of chemistry that makes people stop and stare, the kind that makes audiences start creating theories of their own, and what makes everyone question. The question being, what's actually going on here? So for years it was treated as speculation, rumour and wishful thinking, the sort of things that fans just invent, until Mel B decided to say something that changed the conversation entirely. During an interview, she was asked directly whether she had slept with Geri, and to the shock of many people, she said yes. She didn't spend hours explaining the details or write this expose or memoir. She didn't map out the timeline. She just confirmed. And that was enough. It was enough to completely change how people viewed the rumours, because this wasn't fan fiction or speculation anymore. This was real. This was one of the people involved acknowledging that something had indeed happened. And what's funny is a lot of queer women responded the same way, not with shock, but with, wait, didn't people already realise this? Because for many Sapphic audiences, the revelation wasn't a revelation, it was just a confirmation. We need to talk about one of the things I find the most interesting, and that's the music. Once you start viewing this story through a Sapphic lens, there are certain songs that become really, really fascinating, especially Viva Forever. So the song Viva Forever, it was released in 1998, and it was the final Spice Girls single featuring all 5 of the original members together. A song heavily associated with Geri. It's centered around love, loss, memory, separation. The lyrics of Viva Forever don't describe a straightforward heterosexual romance. Instead, they talk about a secret connection, a relationship preserved in memory, something precious that's been lost. Suddenly, lines that once seem generic start to feel incredibly specific. They don't explicitly say this is about Mel, but they do describe a hidden relationship that queer people have historically experienced. A love that exists and matters but cannot be fully spoken about and survives through memory. Whether you believe the song was directly inspired by Mel or not, it's easy to understand why queer fans have connected those dots, because the emotional core of the song feels familiar, painfully so. To get on to the most controversial part of their story, it's the claim that when Geri left the Spice Girls, it was because of a romantic heartbreak. Now, to be clear, nobody outside the people involved knows exactly what happened. We just don't, and we probably never will. But there are several things that make people pay attention to this theory. Firstly, Geri herself described leaving during a period of intense emotional pain. In her writing, she talks about heartbreak, loss, loving, and losing. Secondly, there doesn't seem to be evidence of a major romantic relationship with a man during this period that would explain those comments. Thirdly, the timing. It's fascinating. Geri's departure happened around Mel's birthday, a detail that's become legendary among fans. Because if you've ever experienced a devastating breakup, you know that people don't always behave rationally. Sometimes it can make people act dramatic, impulsive. Sometimes heartbreak can really burn people and make them want to burn their lives down. And if that's one thing we know about Geri Halliwell, well, she's never ever been afraid of a little bit of drama. Again, none of this proves anything, but it does create a picture that many fans have found compelling. This part of the story interests me the most because it isn't the relationship itself, it's the reaction to it. People have spent decades looking directly at this dynamic and refusing to consider the possibility that it could be a romantic one. That's because society tends to assume heterosexuality by default. If a man and woman behaved this way, people would immediately ask if they're dating. But if two women behave this way, people call them best friends, roommates, sisters, anything except romantic partners. And there's a reason historians joke about this phenomenon because for generations, obvious queer relationships were rewritten as friendships. There are letters describing passionate love that become the evidence of companionship. Lifelong partners become roommates. Entire relationships disappeared, not because the evidence wasn't there, but because people weren't willing to see it. I think that's why so many queer people recognize something in Geri and Mel, because we've spent our whole lives learning to read stories that everyone else ignores. And so at the end of the day, none of us know every detail of what happened between Geri Halliwell and Mel B, but I don't think that's the important part. The important part is that this story exists at all, and it's hidden within one of the biggest pop culture phenomena of the 20th century. And that is a story queer audiences recognised long before anyone else did. A story of connection, possibly love, and, well, almost certainly heartbreak. But definitely a relationship that really meant something. And perhaps one of the fascinating things about this story isn't whether Geri and Mel fell in love. Maybe it's that they could spend years looking at each other like that, writing songs that sounded like that, talking about each other like that, but people were convinced there was nothing there. But queer audiences noticed it, and we always do. Whether it was just a brief romance, a deep love affair, something that existed in between, it's now become a part of queer pop culture history, a hidden Sapphic chapter in one of the biggest stories music's ever told. This might be the most Spice Girl thing imaginable. Girl power really was about choosing a woman after all. Now, if you want to learn more about Sapphic culture, check out the channel. Please hit subscribe, hit the bell, hit like, all of that stuff. I really appreciate you listening and watching this far. And until next time, take care. Bye bye.